In this presentation, we will be going over linear speed, mechanics, and programming for football. This presentation is brought to you by Juan Aquino, Jacob Ruecker, Noah Hendrickson, Paul Coyer, Michael Midlow, Tessa Pierce, and Kyle Whitman as part of the Clemson University Basketball Strength. To have a basic overview and breakdown of speed, we have developed the 3 keys to speed. These 3 keys are velocity, acceleration, and stride. Velocity is equal to the change in distance divided by change in time when running. Acceleration is the ability to move at a high velocity efficiently with correct mechanics. Stride is made up of 3 phases: the drive phase, recovery phase, and support phase. These 3 keys will be discussed in our next slide in more depth. Defining speed. Speed is the ability to move at a high velocity. Now, an athlete must have max velocity and acceleration programming when talking about speed. Acceleration is speeding up rapidly, while max velocity is sprinting at over 75% of full speed. When we talk about acceleration and velocity, stride length is the distance covered with each stride, while stride rate is the amount of time needed to complete a stride cycle. This is measured by the number of strides an athlete takes in a number of time over a given distance. The stride cycle consists of the 3 phases: the drive phase, which is when the foot is in contact with the ground; the recovery phase, which is when the leg swings from the hip while the foot clears the ground; and the support phase, where the athlete's weight is carried by the foot.
When developing speed with our athletes, we want to start with the foundations of speed and proper technique. Like a preface to a book, we want to provide context before we read the story. We want our athletes to understand the why behind how we coach them and how it will help them become a faster player. Second, we want to be as position specific as possible. Every player will not reach max velocity on every play, which leads me to our final point. We will progress by first developing accelerative speed before developing maximal speed. Every player will accelerate, but not every player will hit top speed.
Linear speed development can generally be broken down into 2 main elements: acceleration and maximum velocity. Just as a squat has both an eccentric and concentric component, a 40-yard sprint has both an acceleration and a maximum velocity component. The acceleration phase of a sprint is characterized by a higher ratio of horizontal force when compared to higher vertical forces seen in the maximum velocity phase. In addition, athletes will tend to display a greater body lean, more pronounced hip extension, and longer ground contact times while in the acceleration phase. After transitioning to the maximum velocity phase, athletes will typically assume a more upright running posture with less hip extension and relatively shorter ground contact times. With that being said, we must aim to develop each phase of the sprint by implementing strategies that will yield specific adaptations in order to positively influence either aspect of our athletes' speed development.
For our football players, we designed an 8-week training program split into 2 4-week blocks. We're keeping in mind that an average football play lasts a little over 5 seconds, and that our players are resting anywhere from 16.5 seconds to roughly 47 seconds. We, as a staff, need to make sure we're keeping that in mind during practice and in the weight room, so come game day, their bodies are accustomed to that pace of play. Finally, the last piece of information we want to be aware of when developing speed is percentage of maximal speed between splits. We want our athletes to be aware that those who make it to the NFL in their 10-yard split, they are between 82 to 86% max velocity. In their 15-yard split, they're between 89 and 92% max velocity. And finally, in their 20-yard split, 93 to 96% max velocity.
Proper sprinting technique. Now we will take a look at what we want to see in our athletes' sprinting mechanics. Starting with the torso, we want our athletes to have more of an upright and neutral posture. This will allow for efficient backswing and knee lift. Next, we will look at the athlete's arm action. The arms should be consistent and in rhythm with their knee drive and ground contact. You can see this perfectly demonstrated in the video on the right. Looking at the hips, having a more neutral pelvis will give the athlete the ability to showcase the necessary hip flexion. With that added hip flexion, the knee should then be in a position that is parallel with the hip, and the thigh is near parallel to the ground. Lastly, good ankle stiffness is crucial. The ankle should not collapse easily. Proper ankle stiffness allows the athlete to optimally transmit the force that they developed in their hips and place that down and back into the ground. Common technical errors for sprinting. Within our athletes' sprinting mechanics, these are the most common mistakes they make. Having too much torso lean. This can stem from an excessive anterior pelvis issue or simply never being taught proper sprinting mechanics. Next is improper arm swing. Many efficient sprinters have that really wide arm swing in order to keep their balance. Looking at the hips, we can sometimes notice an excessive anterior pelvis. This issue will ultimately result in a lack of hip flexion. At the same time, it is important to note that you can also have too much hip flexion and not enough extension, as we see in the video on the right. Having too much torso lean paired with the lack of hip flexion, the athlete may try to compensate by having an overextension of the knee, or what many call overreaching. When this occurs, the athlete may be forced to heel strike, which produces that negative braking effect. Lastly, we have the collapsing of the ankle. When an athlete doesn't have the necessary strength and stability to maintain stiffness, they lose out on a significant amount of force projection.
So here we're going to look at a breakdown between a good and a bad acceleration. If you take a look at the bottom picture sequence, you can see that the first initial move that the athlete makes once they start their acceleration is their eyes and head rise up rapidly. That's going to enable the rest of the upper body to follow as well and begin to rise. And as you can see, by even their second step, their upper body is nearly in a full upright position. Now, once that body is in a full upright position at the start, the athlete has no choice but to stay in that full upright position for the remainder of that acceleration. If you take a look at the top picture sequence, you can see that the athlete's eyes and head stay down throughout the majority of this acceleration. Only by the end do you see the athlete's eyes and head begin to rise up. Now, this is crucial for proper acceleration because we want that forward lean. We want the athlete to establish a powerful horizontal ground reaction force. So now that we've established what we want or don't want our acceleration to look like, we need to talk about cueing. Now, these could be cues that you give to an athlete, and these also could be cues that you as a coach are looking for. Our first cue is a powerful arm action. At the start of acceleration, specifically from a static position, we want that arm action to be powerful and to initiate that forward lean and initiate the whole acceleration sequence. That will also help to alleviate the problem with eyes and head rising up if we focus on that powerful arm action. With that forward lean, we are going to establishing that powerful horizontal ground reaction force. We want our foot strike to be under or maybe slightly behind where our hips are. Good front side mechanics to establish that stride length. And also triple extension of the hips, the knee, and the ankle. And now as we learn, we also could talk about quadruple extension and adding an extension of the big toe. So now let's take a look at a breakdown between a good and a bad maximum velocity. If you take a look at the bottom picture sequence, you can see that the athlete is in excessive position with their upper body. They are leaning back. They have an excess lumbar lordosis as well as excess cervical extension of the spine. Their face, arms, and neck are tight and tense, and they are not establishing a proper stride length. Taking a look at the top picture sequence, you can see that the athlete has that proper upward position with their body. Their arms, face, and neck are relaxed, and they are establishing that proper stride length. So looking at cues for maximum velocity, I think the first cue of importance would be hands and face relax. As you saw from that previous slide, if the athlete is excessively leaning back, that's going to cause tension in their neck, in their face, in their shoulders. That's going to establish that improper arm mechanic swing. We want to look for our foot strike just underneath our hips. If we have that foot strike underneath our hips, that's going to enable our other foot to have the optimal full stride length. And we want to establish that full upright position without excessive leaning back. So let's take a look at this being done in real time. You can see the athlete starts with their arm drive and arm swing mechanics. That's going to establish that forward-leaning momentum during the acceleration phase. Triple extension of the hips, knee, and ankle while driving those first few steps from static position. During the acceleration phase, the stride frequency will be increased. As the athlete approaches more of that maximal velocity phase, stride length will be increased.
Looking at our warm-up, our primary goal is to prepare the tissues as well as the central nervous system for intense training to follow. All of these movements should be done at a high intensity with attention to detail. So we have two different sort of warm-up series. One of them is for acceleration, the other one is for max velocity. Regardless of what the focus is for that day, we're going to be starting with our dynamic warm-up movement. And if you take a look at the movements that we selected, they are primarily focused on hamstring extensibility and hip mobility, just getting into deep lunge patterns, similar to what you would see in a sprint. So moving towards the sprinting drills themselves, the acceleration drills are going to be progressing from a march to a skip to a run, and then finally to a 10-yard burst of acceleration. So we're all familiar with an A march, an A skip, and an A run. However, the dribbles are going to be a little bit different. So essentially what a dribble is, it's just a truncated upright running drill that an athlete will be exposed to a cyclic pattern starting at the ankle, then progressing to the shin, and then finally to the knee. And then once they finish that dribble drill, they'll finish off with a 30-yard build-up run. And in this video, you can see an example of a dribble where an athlete starts that cycling sort of piston action at the ankle, then he progresses to the shin, and he finishes at the knee.
Our 8-week program is designed to be run twice a week. The first day will focus on developing acceleration characteristics and optimizing the starting position, while the second day will emphasize reaching and maintaining high velocities. The same progression model can be seen for both days. The prescribed exercises will be used for 2 weeks, with the second week involving more volume, either by increasing the number of sets, repetitions, or time performing the movement. Starting with our acceleration day, the first 2 weeks will focus on our key postures, building movement context, and teaching the piston-like leg action that is required for a successful start. This is achieved by implementing the exercises shown on the previous slides and their various progressions used in the coming weeks. With weeks 3 and 4, we first begin to progress these fundamental movements by adding the bungee cord around the waist. The bungee adds resistance to the movements and requires the athlete to maintain an upright posture. This is an effort to correct the all too common mistake of leaning forward excessively out of the start. We also begin to introduce movements that bring the athlete away from the wall, as seen with our bound and sprint exercises in the latter portions of weeks 3 and 4. The caveat to this is that we are performing these movements with a shoulder harness. This shoulder harness allows the athlete to sync up their arm and leg actions while not being quite as demanding on the posture as the first 2 weeks of the max velocity sessions emphasize creating efficiency in the athlete's back leg recovery and the cyclical leg action required to maintain speed. Once we have these patterns down, our priorities begin to shift towards building the strength required to increase the intensity of these movements. We do this through the use of straight leg exercises to build the posterior chain and using skipping exercises to build reactive strength in the ankle-foot complex. These exercises seen here serve as the basic movements while we continue to progress them to more difficult drills in the final 4 weeks of the program. By working on our start mechanics during our acceleration days and the recovery mechanics on these max velocity days, we can begin to incorporate free sprints into our program. By starting with shorter distance exercises such as the flying 10-yard sprint seen here, we can ensure that the athletes can effectively demonstrate these patterns before progressing to longer distances. As stated in the previous slides, we can't forego the exercises that reinforce our fundamental movement patterns, but we must increase the difficulty of these movements for continued adaptation. In the final 4 weeks, we will completely step away from the wall drills but increase the difficulty of these movements by having the athletes hold a medicine ball overhead. This continues to challenge their postural strength in these movements while reinforcing an upright posture in their free sprints as well. Another staple of these final weeks is the inclusion of sled-resisted training on our acceleration days. The added resistance of the sled reinforces the driving, piston-like action required for optimal acceleration while limiting the top-end speeds that the athlete can reach in an effort to preserve the nervous system for the max velocity. The final weeks of the max velocity sessions are all about putting the pieces together. This is what we have been working towards throughout this program. The progressive build-ups will serve as our main technical work, while the flying 20-yard sprints will give the athletes an opportunity to get faster by running fast. By making technique a staple in our program, this will not only make the athletes faster on test day, but allow them to transfer that speed on.
Here we have an acceleration drill from our program. This is the single leg exchange. The athletes will place their hands on the wall and want to have their body at a 45-degree angle. They'll bring one knee up, and on the coach's call, they will switch legs and bring the opposite knee up. They want to focus on driving that back leg up as fast as possible and make sure that their leg contacts the ground in the same place on each rep. Here's an example of a max velocity drill from our program. It's the flying 10-yard sprint. On the coach's call, the athlete will start running and build up speed over 10 to 20 yards, leading into a full speed burst for 10 yards. These are our references. Thank you for joining us for this football speed presentation.